Welcome to Rejected Religion Spotlight. My guest today is Dr. Joel Bardo. Joel holds a PhD in religion from Columbia University and is currently a research fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies located at Leiden University here in the Netherlands. His research interest includes South Asian and Himalayan religions, new religious movements, as well as esotericism, just to name a few. So welcome to Spotlight, Joel.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm very happy that you had time to talk to me today. You've written a very interesting chapter about the occult dimensions of Grant Morrison's Batman comics. In particular, the initiation or death and rebirth of Batman in that story. And I am always on the lookout for any references to esotericism or occulture in the official term of the occult in popular culture. So when I came across your article, I was really hoping that you would be able to talk to me. So I'm really happy that we could set this up. But before we get into discussing the article, what inspires you to write about Batman?
So it's not, I wouldn't call it an inspirational story, perhaps even. It could be of interest still in the how the academic sausage gets made file. Essentially, I have worked with comics a decent amount in my teaching in any case. I've used parts of Sandman for in some classes, and Promethea and others, some of the NDR Authentic series in other cases too. But I hadn't written about much of any of it. The volume that this came out in, the Assimilation of Yogic Traditions in Pop Culture, I believe it was parsed out in such a way. The editor had a particular balance in mind for articles that had to do with comics and had to do with television and so on. And apparently at the 11th hour or so, maybe the 10th hour, one of the comics people had to withdraw for whatever reason. So I got a call and it's sort of like, hey, you're a comics nerd. Like, do you want to do a thing? And I said, oh, yeah, I think I could do that. And I started pitching things like, I could do this thing on like Jodorowsky's Inkal or whatever. And it wound up being this kind of game of like, you're getting warmer, you're getting colder. And so eventually I said something about Grant Morrison. And then the guy's like, yeah, Grant Morrison. And I was like, okay, I'll do the Invisibles. And he's like, nope, no. More mainstream, like Batman. It's like, yes, that's the one. So I assume my impression is anyway, there was already meant to be a chapter on Grant Morrison's Batman, and I inherited the idea.
I see.
But it's good fun and sort of it's certainly one of the least painful writing assignments I think I've ever had. I mean, just any day that you can wake up and sit down and read Batman and legitimately claim that you're working is a pretty good day.
Definitely. This is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so your chapter is entitled The Dark Night of the Soul, Death as Initiatory Ordeal in Grant Morrison's Batman R.I.P. And in this chapter, you explore the narrative of death and rebirth that Batman experiences in the mountains of Tibet. And in Morrison's comic, Batman must undergo an ego death, but does so by self-inducing a fracturing of his personality, a type of dissociative identity disorder of his own making, if you will. And Morrison uses Buddhist concepts in their story. And one of them begins with a T, and I'll let you talk about that and pronounce it because I don't want to mangle it. But if you could discuss these things in more detail, and also why Batman is using all of these Buddhist concepts in the story.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think I can try to do that. Although it's extremely convoluted, as these things tend to be.
They always are.
Both from Morrison and from esoteric Buddhism. So I mean, I think the easiest thing to sort of put on the table in some ways is what is it doing in the Batman comics? And I think to a substantial degree, this is about Morrison's own his narrative reasons for this and aesthetic and philosophical reasons. One thing that he has expressed, I think, at various points an interest in is the sort of foundational superhero trope of the kind of secret identity, right? So that plays directly into this. In particular, I think one thing that he wanted to do with his entire Batman run was to try to find some way to integrate the dozens of different Batmen that you have, right, from the campy Adam West TV shows to the sort of grittier Christopher Nolan. He wanted to try to find a way to work all of those somehow to make them somehow the same character. And that plays directly into his other sort of fascination with this idea of embracing this kind of DID as a solution to modern alienation. He's played with this idea. It picks up a thread from his Arkham Asylum one shot that he did some years previously. But this idea that essentially in a mad world, the only way that you're going to successfully navigate a mad world is to become mad yourself, and that could be a kind of super sanity or something. So there are all these sort of aesthetic and these reasons that have nothing really basically to do with Buddhism per se. Right. But he has said that he particularly wanted to use this run of Batman to introduce his readers to Dzogchen, or to, rather, I think he said something to the effect of to make them research it. So he wanted to drop in at least enough that people would have to go and poke around and try to figure out what's going on with it. So, I mean, the main ideas that he uses, I think there are, funnily enough, they fall into two categories. One is the most very basic Buddhist notion that the idea of a self as a permanent, inherently existing phenomenon is illusory. So in terms of the specific Buddhist content, I think we can break that into two basic categories. One is a really foundational notion, and the other is extremely rarefied esoteric meditation techniques. And he doesn't really get much of anything in between, which is kind of part of what I write about, is all this the things that he leaves out. But so in the first instance, we're talking about the foundational kind of insight that the Buddha is meant to have had, that the self as we experience it anyway, as if it were a sort of a given, as a inherently existing permanent phenomenon, is illusory, that it's in fact it only exists in dependence on these various causes and conditions, karmic factors and other more obvious things, like it has to have a physical basis, and you have to have feelings and perceptions and karmic causes that give rise to it. So I think Morrison uses that basic idea to underlie a lot of this kind of intentional fracturing of the personality kind of narrative that he uses. That's what makes that possible, right? If there were one inherently existing Batman, then none of that could have made sense. Exactly. Or for that matter, then Bruce Wayne wouldn't also really make much of any sense. Right. Right. So, but so there's that sort of foundational notion, and then he sort of skips everything in between, the whole sort of edifice of Buddhist philosophy, and jumps to what is, at least according to those people who are practitioners of it, the most secret, the most intense and highest level practice within the Tibetan tradition, which is it's called Dzogchen. It means the great perfection, and it styles itself as a practice that sits atop. Well, so in Indian philosophy in general, there's a tendency to say, instead of saying that other views are explicitly wrong, you relegate them to that they're provisionally true, as a lower level of your own understanding of a given position. Okay. So the tendency is just to rank things in terms of how right they are, where right means how close are they to your own view. So in this sense, Dzogchen isn't really that different from the way other traditions deal with this, but in a general sense, this is coming out of a tantric Buddhist milieu. And so if you're talking about that already, you've got a situation where you have the Theravada, broadly speaking, form of Buddhism that's practiced in Southeast Asia, and the Mahayana, so the greater vehicle to the tradition of the elders in Southeast Asia, the great vehicle in East Asia, generally in Tibet. And the people in the Mahayana view the Theravada as a lower form. Okay. Within the Mahayana, there's another sort of split, and there are tantric practitioners within that. And they tend to view the exoteric Mahayana as a lower form. And then within the tantric view, or like sort of even potentially sitting on top of it like a cherry on a sundae, are the Dzogchen people, and they say, well, even the tantric stuff is a little bit below what we're doing. So what Morrison does is basically skips through all the intermediary stages and jumps right to the very end. So what Dzogchen tries to do, or what it claims to do, is essentially to engage directly with non-conceptual, to engage the non-conceptual mind directly. It claims to bypass all the various meditative techniques and the analytical philosophy, and introduce the practitioner directly to the luminous, inherent nature of consciousness without an object. So in practice, this would only be something you'd ever get to having moved all the way through, lots and lots of intermediate stages, and then having practiced the tantric stuff with all the visualizations and all the various rituals, and then so on. But he picks up with the higher stages of Dzogchen with a practice called Tugal, which means to leap over. So it's this idea that you're going to, it's the final jump, into the direct experience of the mind as a luminous. And so this happens, there's a part of it anyway, it has no techniques allegedly, but there are some techniques, of course. Part of it does involve something called Yangti, which is another thing that Morrison includes in the story, which is a dark retreat where one locks oneself, so to speak, in a cave, and there are visionary experiences which would occur. You can call it prisoner's cinema, or however you want to think about that. But right, if people have ever done sensory deprivation, these kinds of things will happen. These are interpreted within the context of Tugal as the natural luminescence of the mind manifesting. And so the visions that you encounter eventually, at least towards the end, are perceived as a collection of 100 deities. And when all of that sort of comes to its climax, then you have a bursting forth of sort of enlightened consciousness. So I think the thing that Morrison does in some ways here is he conflates two ideas which are very closely related. So the 100 deities that you are meant to encounter at the end of this kind of sensory deprivation retreat are the same deities that presumably all of us will encounter at the moment of death. So when there's the Tibetan tradition talks about this thing called the Bardo, this sort of between state, which lasts up to 7 weeks or something from when you die until the next time that you reincarnate, or your consciousness reincarnates, right? Because you won't be you anymore. But that continuum goes on, and during this process, which is detailed in the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's a whole literature around this. You will encounter supposedly these 100 deities. So I think what he's done is, because those 100 deities occur at the moment of death, supposedly to everyone, and in the dark retreat, there are practices that are done that are meant to induce an experience of these deities. He has conflated the idea of the retreat and the dying experience in the way that he depicts what's going on with Batman. So Batman in the story does this dark retreat in order, he says, to experience what death is like. And so I think that's kind of where that's what Morrison tries to do with it. It's a reasonable. You can imagine easily how he gets there. If supposedly phenomenologically the experience would be somewhat similar, but it's not how it would traditionally play out.
Okay, I see. So this is happening in the story before he is splitting his personality, or after? I guess it's before, because he's doing all of his training in Tibet before he goes back. Correct? So he's getting his foundation. And is this then considered the initiation for him?
Yes. So in the story, there seems potentially also to be time travel involved, so it's a little buggy.
Okay.
As these things can be. Narratively, what appears to, if I understand correctly, what happens is there's a point earlier in the run where Batman subjects himself to just a regular bog standard sensory deprivation experiments. So the doctor who conducts this experiment for him, or whose experiments he participates in, is given the name Dr. Hurt. And there's some suggestion that he may be the actual devil, which gives it there's a lot of strange sort of Christian things going on in the story as well. But he's a villain in any case. And as part of this, he implants into Batman / Bruce Wayne's subconscious or unconscious mind the idea that he's killed Robin, or he's done something that's got Robin killed, and that he wants to retire from being the Batman. And so this is supposedly the subconscious mind bomb or something, some kind of post-hypnotic suggestion that's kind of lurking in the back of his mind, to be activated later on with some keyword. And when Batman goes to Nanda Parbat, which isn't exactly Tibet, but it's like the sort of DC universe,
right.
Nepal, Tibet stand-in place. And he does this Togao practice and experiences death. It's when it turns up this previous experience.
Right. Okay.
So that's how he discovers that he's been, that there's been this bug planted, basically. And at that point, he, realizing that this is going to be a thing that will happen at some point to him in the future, right? And Batman being, his whole shtick in a way is just that he plans for everything. Yeah. Right. So Batman always has a plan. So he puts a plan in motion, which is to say he wants backups of his personality that will come into effect when this happens. So when he consciously renounces being Batman, then there will be this other Batman that will come into effect, which is the kind of insane Batman with the baseball bat, that Batman instead of, so yeah, narratively it's part of a way of dealing with, the sort of diabolical plans of this medical professional.
Okay. All right. So that's more clear in my head now. Okay. So when Batman is in this cave situation, he's going through all of these practices and rituals. You explain in your chapter that Morrison is talking about, I'm if I'm remembering correctly, that he's talking about this process as being the initiation for Batman. But you note that Morrison is using the term in a different way than a traditional Buddhist would. So could you talk more about that, about Morrison's more likely location of actually Freemasonry as being the inspiration for the usage of the term and not so much Buddhism?
Right. So this was one of the biggest sort of giveaways for me, was the way that the language of initiation is used here in the Batman story. I wouldn't say, it is Freemasonry after a fashion. We're talking about, esoteric co-masonry or, sort of theosophy, that branch of things more than sort of standard craft masonry, as I think the proximate origin of a lot of these ideas. So what I think the way that he's using it is based on a kind of distinction that's drawn sometimes more clearly than others within Western esoteric contexts, often between ceremonial and real initiation, right? So there's initiation in the sense that coming out of a Masonic milieu, where it's basically just a play that you're thrown into, and you're the only one that hasn't got the script, right? So everyone else knows what's going on, but you show up, blindfolded, and there are all these oaths to be sworn and so forth. At least at the lower level things. So there's that notion of initiation as being a sort of theater, a community theater, and the other side of it, which is sometimes stated later in, I think Annie Besant or Alice Bailey, some of these Theosophist writers in the early part of the 20th century make this much more clear, that is a communication of a larger secret, which is the so-called real initiation. When you grasp what the meaning of the drama was, that's when the consciousness of the initiate is actually changed in some significant way. So I think that's what, when he's using initiation, he imagines at least that is something that happens in the initiation that he's describing. Is that there's some significant change. It's not just a question of showing up and going through a bit of a play, but that there's some significant thing that happens. So I think the other way of thinking about this, and it's common to a lot of initiatory traditions in a way, is that at least for some, and this is true in Buddhist, in some Buddhist initiations as well, in some of these traditions, there's a common thread is that the initiations themselves are modeled after some kind of death rebirth sequence, whereby to put it in very sort of the most boring sort of sociological terms, right? The previous identity of the person who is not yet initiated is set aside, and the new identity as a member of the group with various privileges and things comes into being. That sequence, though, is obviously one that has a great deal of symbolic weight, and people, and it lends itself very easily to the idea of being, reborn as a different kind of person altogether, a different kind of entity. So I think this is what he's working with, and certainly coming out of Crowley, who I think is a very obvious influence on Morrison. I talk about this a little bit in the chapter. Crowley starts working his way through the Golden Dawn graded system, but as far as we know, the Golden Dawn had not even written. They had no texts even for the top 3 or so of their 10 levels. And yet Crowley claims that he underwent those initiations. So at some point, at least for him, and certainly for the Theosophists as well, these initiations become a thing that is entirely separate from any sort of a group ritual. That it's a thing that either with the hidden masters or the Mahatmas or whomever, the secret chiefs, effect in your own life, in your own consciousness, by whatever magical or remote means at their disposal, that change the practitioner and allow you to mark a stage in your sort of religious development. That said, Togal is not an initiation. Togal, the thing that he describes consistently, Morrison describes consistently as initiation, is a practice that one does. You need initiation to do it, but that would be a thing that would happen previous to that. And in fact, what you would get is an initiation that allows you to study the philosophical bases for the practices that you would do, and that would be another prerequisite that you would have to do before embarking on this retreat. So I think the way that he uses the imagery and the way that he uses the language of initiation here is a pretty clear giveaway that he's coming at it not from a Buddhist framework, because a Buddhist framework, there are initiations, they're important. they are pretty clearly understood to be, and this is hashed out in some Buddhist philosophical literature, the initiations don't make huge changes in, I mean, you're still going to have to practice, right? It's more or less, it's often, it's permission to begin to do a practice. And then 40 years down the road, if you've been doing the thing every day, then you get the result of it, it'll finally come to fruition. But just getting the initiation, it's not going to do a whole lot. Because you've got karma and all those things to deal with, and that certainly takes time.
Right.
So the thinking goes.
So it does seem to be a different type of process than you see a lot of times in Western esoteric literature or accounts of initiatory experiences being a very personal, kind of overwhelming type of thing. For some people, it's, this almost intense spiritual experience. But yeah, for a Buddhist, it seems to be just a part of the whole process, the actual beginning of it, that you just have to do that to move on and keep moving forward in your practice. So yeah, there's a definite difference there. You mentioned Crowley, however, and how those teachings about the abyss play an important role in Batman's ego death. And it does seem, knowing what I know about the idea, the concept of the abyss, it does seem to be fitting more with Batman's narrative in this sense. And you also note in your chapter how the whole notion of the abyss, that also goes against any type of, or not goes against, but it's just not the same as the Buddhist teachings would view the experience. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about how Crowley influences Morrison in this regard, about the differences between the ideas surrounding quote unquote ego death, and how Morrison seems to be leaning more towards Crowley.
Sure. Yeah. Just to retcon something that I said a moment ago, I think it is worth noting that in earlier tantric literature, there are ways in which these initiations are, some of them anyway, are understood to be powerfully emotionally affecting events.
Okay.
In fact, the events in which it is known that it has taken effect if the initiate exhibits various strong reactions, like sort of shaking or weeping, or basically it's thought to be to induce a form of possession by a god or gods, and the understanding would have been, at least at that point, that you only really know if it works if the initiate has this really strong reaction. Over time, of course, these things become massively routinized, and you have the Dalai Lama giving initiations to hundreds of thousands of people in Central Park, and no one's really checking to see if you don't expect anyone to have sort of a fit or a seizure to authenticate that it's taken root. So it becomes routinized, I think, is kind of the key thing there. So as to the question of the abyss, I think, I think Crowley's influence on Grant Morrison is quite extensive, and you can think of it as coming in a couple of different ways. One is directly, in the sense that Morrison references Crowley at several points overtly in the writing, and the other is via chaos magic, which, from my point of view, is something that is extremely indebted to Crowley, perhaps even more than a lot of chaots might be inclined to admit. So there's that on a philosophical / practical level. There's also the general idea of art as being itself a magical act, and the kind of way that Crowley would use the rites of Lucis and things like that as sort of dramatic performances as magic, and Morrison does similar things in terms of the way that this hyper sigils, the way that they talk about the invisibles and some of these other writing projects. So the abyss, which is also kind of where the title that I pulled, the idea of the sort of dark night of the soul, this kind of crisis, this existential crisis, is a thing that that Crowley, I think, in particular, imagines takes place, in the Sephiroth, on the sort of tree of life. Right, there's the idea that you have this fourth Sephiroth, Da'at, in some schemes anyway, that was there, and it's like imploded or something, and so you can't make a clear. You have to cross a sort of a chasm where this Sephiroth used to be, or Sephira used to be. And so that's the so-called abyss, is this area that now there's sort of a gap in the track. And so it's this interruption in the continuity of memory, which I guess is the general way that we sort of construct personhood, that would be so destructive to the idea of a person, if you have a very linear narrative idea of the self, as most of us presumably do. That gap in experience would be so instructive that it would be impossible to put Humpty Dumpty together again, on the other side of that, even if one sort of reemerges. So to borrow sort of Crowley's link, the Humpty Dumpty thing is actually one of the bits that he uses in book 4 when he's talking about this. It's kind of a funny passage. But so this idea of this being a really traumatic experience where one has this, kind of almost a psychotic break or something, and comes out of it, this can only be survived by this extreme compartmentalization of the personality or something, is something that Morrison, I think, gets pretty directly from Crowley. I would say, though, that a couple of things here that spring immediately to mind. One is, again, it's hard to know with Crowley as well how much of this is Crowley has, if you kind of Google around or you kind of go looking, there are like 30 something different, pseudonyms and things that he writes under. He's got all these different occult mottos, right? Is he, VVVVV or Therion or Baphomet or Perdurabo or Paramahamsa Shivaji, or, he's got like so many of these. And arguably even the although it's a lower attainment, the sort of knowledge and conversation of the guardian angel, the holy guardian angel, can be a similar process of, Crowley vacillates on this idea, I think, but in some ways what you're doing, or sometimes he thinks that what you're doing is externalizing some aspect of oneself from the subconscious so that you can access it directly with the conscious mind. So the holy guardian angel is also arguably a similar phenomenon of sort of fracturing the personality in kind of a deliberate way. So I mean, it's kind of a recurring theme within these traditions. I think that's something that Morrison latches onto. The idea that it's also supposed to be like a really harrowing experience is something that I think you can understand why Morrison thinks so, and why Crowley might think so. So the Buddhist idea behind this, generally speaking, I mean, there are a range of ways that, of course, any tradition is, it's always precarious to try to speak for the Buddhist view on anything, right? But does not generally include the idea that the dissolution of the ego is a harrowing, traumatic experience. Because the doctrine is so foundational. And in fact, the doctrine is the thing that, when properly understood, is supposed to actually relieve one from suffering and furthermore explain how the world actually works, right? It's the thing that supposedly, when you really understand it, then that's when one grasps how it is that karma works and all the big important questions, anyway, about the universe suddenly snap into place, because you begin to attribute things to their proper causes and conditions, and you lose fixed ideas about things, and so you become much more flexible in approach. So it's not meant to be, at least as I understand it, it's not meant to be anything that's particularly frightening. If anything, it's a comfort. And there are, within certain tantric initiations, there are certainly death and rebirth sequences that take place, although the initiate probably doesn't see them. It's all happening visualized in the mind of the initiator. The initiating guru visualizes the whole thing, basically. But you are taught as part of it, and this is pan-Indic tantric traditions, your daily practice would then involve a sort of reenactment of the initiation, in which you would visualize the destruction of your physical body, and moving your consciousness to a visualized or a mind-made body. So again, not considered to be a problem. It's just kind of the basic thing that you have to do is sort of in order to the sort of buzzword in tantric context around this is that you have to become a god to worship a god. So in order to sort of shed your human limitations, then, you destroy the body with fire, you wash it with water, transfer your consciousness into this other purer form, and that's the place from whence you can conduct the rituals. So yeah, it's not a problem. It's also, in general sense, broadly speaking, in Tibet anyway. You might have other things to think about Zen or something, but in Tibet, this is an extremely gradual process. It's not considered that you're going to have much of any way to experience it as a sudden rupture. In fact, you would have, a great philosophical training. You learn various kinds of analytic meditation, and you bounce back and forth between the analysis mode and the sort of more what we might think of as standard meditative practices. And you kind of basically do those faster and faster. So you alternate them until you can kind of blend your experience of meditation and what they call post-meditation, so that you begin to actually experience so-called normal life through this, deconstructed frame. But that's, again, decades of work, learning to switch back and forth between deep meditative states and real, quote unquote, real life, until you can blur the two. So you're not going to be thrown off by it, is the thinking. Okay. And the Tugal in particular, it's not about death at all. So it's not about initiation. It's also not about death. The idea is that, in addition to the energetic body, the one with all the chakras and things like that, which is now fully absorbed into Western esoteric tradition, in Dzogchen, they also posit that there's a luminous body that exists alongside that, or in tandem with it. So there are all these channels that run separately from the chakras and things like that, that can convey light throughout the body, which allow us to perceive things, for instance, and that are sort of substrata of mind. And some of these run actually through the eyes. And so when you lock yourself up in this cave, what you're actually seeing, supposedly, is the manifestation of this underlying physiological, psychophysiological powers that are exiting the eyes to become visible, because you've just eliminated all the other distractions that would normally get in the way. So even though it's going to include 50-ish terrifying deities at some point, by the time you get to that, you've just had this glorious light show for however long, right? And again, at each point, basically just meditating along through it, going like, oh, this is nice. This is some underlying level of my mind that's manifesting. You've been training for this, it's philosophical grounding. And then the deities, by the time you see them, you encounter them, arrayed in a geometric mandala, and everything's in its right place. And so they're the, 40, however many, people say 50 and 50, but it's not exactly 50 and 50, but they're also the 50-ish peaceful deities that are there alongside them. And it's all a big sort of balanced thing, and not a harrowing death experience or near-death experience. At least that's the idea. For what Morrison is doing, and the kind of thing that Batman in the story, is trying to achieve, of, tasting death and making sure that he's got a plan for it all. And, basically nothing can, emerging as this kind of fearless, unflappable, even more so than the usual Batman figure from having done this is, it's very much more on the existential crisis mode than the, fantastic light show in the cave thing that would be what an advanced, extremely, I want to stress this, extremely advanced Buddhist practitioner would be doing.
Right. Yes, there's obviously a mixing of different traditions and systems happening in this story, even though it's put into a quote unquote Buddhist context. There are all these other contexts as well happening within this this whole narrative about what's happening to Batman, of course. So, and you point this out that Morrison is using, all of these different elements and is drawing upon various sources for their story. And as you mentioned, they are a chaos magician who views their own writing as a magical act or ritual. And this writing is shaping their own experiences. Also, the readers who are engaging with it, it's also shaping their experiences. So they have a very broad viewpoint of what is actually happening when you're creating something. That goes much further than how just a quote unquote basic way of approaching creating a story. So and as you also mentioned, comic books are already known, the whole genre is already known for containing occult themes. You mentioned Promethea and Invincibles, and those are, and it's not a secret either. I mean, the authors talk about how they're inspired by occult themes. So we can then, of course, see this as we mentioned before, occulture, this appropriating all of these concepts into popular culture and comics. That's one area where this is happening. And Morrison uses, of course, the chaos magic and the Tibetan Buddhism. Even if one isn't specifically aware of these themes when you're reading and engaging with the material, it's there. It's everywhere. As Christopher Partridge says, occulture is everywhere. So, and it's not just Batman. It's other comics that are doing this, such as recently WandaVision came out. Of course, they're talking about chaos magic in WandaVision. Doctor Strange is using more ritual magic, ceremonial magic, maybe in that film and in those comics. So what are your thoughts about this syncretic way of using Buddhist philosophy, in this particular case with Batman, and the bricolage that takes place with the chaos magic? And we see this now, we're seeing it more and more and more in Western popular culture. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a fascinating development from my point of view. I find the entire notion of chaos magic or Discordianism, in some ways the more sort of Zen heavy, like American version of it. I find it entirely fascinating, partially because, at least for me, I find myself particularly interested in the question of people's subjective commitments versus their ritual practices. It is anecdotal, I guess, but generally, if you're on the right message boards and things like that, understood that a decent chunk of the people coming out of the chaos magic scene, so the old guard, went off into Tibetan Buddhism in the 90s, and in particular into the Nyingma, the name literally means the old school. which is the one that has Dzogchen as the highest teachings. So, I mean, I think just the notion of having, these Buddhist centers potentially, maybe not filled with, but populated to some extent by people who are actually on some, background process, who are thinking of what they're doing as sort of chaos magic, and they're just adopting a paradigm for a certain point, a certain time. Mm-hmm. I think is entirely fascinating, and it's not so different, I guess, from the kind of thing that I was looking at last week at the talk that I did about these sort of Buddhist traditionalists, who are similarly coming at it with a different kind of meta frame, mm-hmm. Practicing Buddhism, but with this other idea in mind. So, I mean, I'm personally, I'm for it. I want more of it wherever we can get it, just for my own edification. Where do I think it comes from? I think there are a couple of things that are, it makes it hard to pin down. There's a bit of a pizza effect, or however you want to think of this, because so much of the contemporary occult milieu is already kind of shot through with Buddhist ideas. The Theosophists do this. Crowley is super into it. Yeah. Kenneth Grant, especially if you go off into sort of chaos circles, Kenneth Grant's a big deal, and you have Lam with the various the sort of alien thing that Crowley supposedly contacted, mm-hmm. Has his Tibetan connections. I think the Tibetan Buddhist traditions in particular wind up being especially attractive to some people for a number of reasons. One is that they are at least represented, and perhaps with some good reasons, as being more quote unquote sort of shamanic or inclined towards practical magic than a lot of other Buddhist traditions that we have access to in the West. Which is not to say there isn't plenty of like practical magic and stuff in a lot of these other traditions too, but the Tibetan Buddhism is very tantra forward, if we want to think of it in those terms. That it was just so mainstream that by the time Buddhism went to Tibet, it was the height of the time in India where tantric Buddhism was like really in its heyday, and so it never really became it wasn't like it was esoteric in the sense that you had to take initiations to get access to it, but not in the sense that anybody doubted that that it was still the normal thing that everybody did. So all these kind of practices that deal with, consciously navigating the dying process, or working with lucid dreaming, or sexual yogas, or even sort of like sorcery and sort of like aggressive magic, these kinds of things, or wealth practices. All this stuff is very easily accessible for a lot of people in a Tibetan Himalayan Buddhist context. So there's that. It's also late to the scene in the West. The actual getting any real information about Tibetan Buddhism is a little bit long in coming. So partially what that means is then, and it only really happens after the PRC, after the Communist Party and Cultural Revolution starts to do its work, its renovation in Tibet. So it's very easy for people, especially who don't know the history very well, to think, Tibet was a sort of pre-modern Shangri-La, hidden mountain kingdom ruled by sort of divine Dalai Lama figures. And that, it's inaccessible now, right? So that's gone. So people can't necessarily even if they go to Tibet and say, well, okay, Tibetans are just kind of like anybody else. They're not all actually walking around, working wonders. They're not all thaumaturgy. Some of them are just shopkeepers. It's easy enough to chalk that up to, well, that's Mao's fault, right? It's not because presumably it used to be that way. Mm-hmm. They also have really good press. Traditionally speaking, that's they have very positive media representation, mm-hmm. and not a lot of history of Tibetans don't tend to get too excised over being portrayed inaccurately in the media, as like a number of other traditions might. So they're very convenient for Dr. Strange to go to Tibet. or Batman or whatever, right? Because the Tibetans, generally speaking, are not really going to care all that much. Yeah, there's not much. I mean, and for some reasons, also, you can understand why other groups might. There's no real equivalent of like Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom for Tibetan Buddhism, right? Where it looks like it's doing human sacrifices and tossing people into lava and eating monkey brains, right? It's kind of the Tibetans, generally speaking, they're kind of it's fine, and they rely on it in a way. I mean, the cachet of the Tibetan international cachet is predicated on Buddhism substantially, and on foreigners having a positive view of this.
Sure.
So I think that's a lot of it. It's very easily accessible in some ways. In terms of actual content, I think coming at it from Crowley directly, although he's very underinformed for various reasons about Tibetan Himalayan Buddhism. Actually, funnily enough, I brought this up once to a friend of mine who's a Thelemite, and so yeah, I was talking once about this to a friend of mine who's a Thelemite, and he said something I thought was kind of interesting, which is that he was glad that Crowley had not really got access to or understood Tibetan Buddhism very much, because if he had, then there wouldn't have been Thelema, that Crowley would have just looked at that and been like, oh yeah, this is pretty much what I'm after. And it was to that.
Right.
And so, we would all have been robbed of all the these fascinating developments.
Things happen for a reason.
Yeah. But so I think for Chaos and coming out, so Crowley, the connection I was trying to make there is, Crowley has these extremely anti-rational tendencies in his writing, kind of coming out of romantic notions, but also this is something that feeds into chaos magic extensively, right? So Crowley is, what is it? Enough of because, be it damned for a dog, and so on, right? And the chaos magicians pick up with, nothing is true and everything's permitted. Belief is a tool. So I think that people coming out of that milieu look at the Buddhist deconstruction of, basically everything. And the emphasis on the kind of limits of language, the idea that, at least within a lot of contexts, that what philosophy is for is to basically walk you right up to the brink of what you can do with language, and then you sort of topple over the edge into the experience of whatever you're trying to get to. That kind of anti-rationalism, in a way, they imagine as being commensurate. And so I think, more than many other traditions, perhaps, the Buddhism seems the closest thing to hand. And as I said, it's baked in from the beginning, because if you have, Theosophy and Crowley and things like that feeding into these traditions already, it could seem like coming home to some extent, right? You're combining things that are already pretty close together. It's also true that a couple of other things, I think. One is that within, more so than any of the other forms of tantric traditions that I'm aware of, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is pretty clear that a lot of these practices, even down to things like, how many chakras are there, what colors are they, which deities you're working with, and how many, arms have they got, and all these kinds of things, what the mantras are. So many of these things are pretty obviously arbitrary. That is to say, they vary substantially from text to text and from lineage to lineage. And Tibetans are well aware of this. And so it can look a lot like paradigm shifting, I guess, in a way, if you're working from one system where there's 4 chakras and the next one that's got 8. And, you're doing one day, or one in the morning and the other one in the afternoon, and you just sort of mix it up. That's a thing that would be like reasonably well established, and very much gives the sense that these are things that are not meant to be grounded in the same kind of empirical reality that people, I think, generally in an occult milieu, if you ask them, they probably think they've got 7 chakras and like that's an actual physiological fact. Tibetan Buddhist tradition generally isn't going to go in for that. There are, as many as like 22 in some contexts, and just 3 in others, and anything can happen in between. And the importance is just kind of work the system as you inherit it. How it's taught in the lineage, and don't correct it or try to bring it into line with anything else. Just try to work within one paradigm, if you want to think of it in those terms. So I think that's very familiar to people. The 2 other things, one is that there's also within the Nyingma tradition, which is the one that these Dzogchen texts come out of, there's a thing called terma, which is the idea of these are teachings that the theory goes that in the 8th century, there's an Indian teacher who first brings Buddhism to, or establishes it in Tibet. And he's a second Buddha, basically. Padmasambhava is his name. So he's a full-on tantric Buddhist master. And he initiates the king and the whole court and some of the queens into Buddhism. And knowing that, over time, that the circumstances are going to change and that different kinds of teachings will be necessary, implants in their mental continua teachings that will be, or the ability to understand teachings that are written in code that will be pulled out of mountainsides or something later on. He scatters all these teachings amongst these 25 courtiers and throughout the landscape. And so that at various points, as needed, these teachings are quote unquote recovered, and they are exactly suited to the time. And the newer, the better, because the newer they are, the more likely it is that means that they were meant to have been recovered exactly for our present circumstances, and they haven't had time to get sort of like corrupted or whatever. That there's, so that kind of emphasis on like the newest thing is actually something that you can find, and on things being adapted to present circumstances is something that's also built in particular to this school, that I think for a lot of kind of chaos magician types would appreciate.
And what was the name of this school again? Your microphone was a little bit blocked, and I couldn't hear the word that you said.
Oh, sorry. Nyingma. Okay. Nyingma. And it literally just means the ancient school.
Okay.
So, the development of the school is basically what happens is Buddhism comes to Tibet in 2 phases. So the first is this 8th century, when the king imports it, and they bring in this guy, Padmasambhava, who founds the school. There is, after a couple of generations, basically a palace coup, and a new regime comes into power who think that the monasteries are getting too powerful, and so the story goes. And so they sort of suppress Buddhism, and that means that after a while, the ordination lineages get compromised. And so in the 11th century, 10th, 11th century, a new sort of Buddhist dynasty comes into power, and they re-import Buddhism from India because they want to reestablish the monastic lineages. So then you have, at that point, a proliferation of new schools, and the previous Buddhists that were there become the old school.
Oh, okay. I see.
And that's also where these terma come in, because when Buddhism has been developing in India for a couple of centuries in the meantime, and all kinds of things like Kundalini yoga have developed, which weren't really there in the first, when it first came around.
Okay.
So if we're being cynical about it anyway, this is the idea is that what happens is these new teachings come in from India in the 10th, 11th century, and the old school say, well, of course, yeah, we had those too. And they were just like buried in these people to like reincarnating, and we pull them from out of mountains, and we have all these coded texts. All the stuff you've got, we've already got it. And in fact, now we have all this Dzogchen stuff, which you haven't got. So like, that's why it's extra special.
I see. Okay. So
there's a very practical efficacy.
Yes. I see. But with regard to the Westerners who are approaching this, as you mentioned before about this, the idea for the Buddhists that they, these things that are hidden that you're finding at a particular point, and it's the new thing that you're finding, that this is like an innovative type of thing that is happening within this system. It seems like for the Westerners that are using like either chaos magic, for example, that there's also kind of a pragmatic thing happening there as well, that you're mixing and blending things together and making something new that is useful. It works for you, and if it doesn't work for you, then you leave it. So I don't know if it's the same type of approach to the practice or the work that you're trying to do. Is it as pragmatic for the Buddhists as it is for the chaots?
Well, that's
or is it really not comparable?
My inclination is to say no, okay. But there's a way in which you could argue that it is. I think what I imagine happens is kind of this in both instances. A lot of these things do ride on the prestige of whether they quote unquote work or not. Has to do a lot with the prestige of whoever is propounding the traditions in question, and that I think is also true with the terma. So like lots of alleged terma, it means treasure. So lots of these treasures are recovered, which are not universally accepted as being legitimate. They're more likely to be considered legitimate if it comes from somebody who's like from a famous lineage, or if they're very well written, or if they become really popular for any number of other kind of idiosyncratic reasons. Yeah. But they're not all accepted. There's a kind of authentication from within the tradition. I think though that's not terribly different from the kinds of things that are going to happen in chaos magic circles. Yeah. That for all the rhetoric around everything being based on, success is your proof, like whether you have success or not is going to depend to some substantial degree on how invested you are in it and how credible you find the practice to be to begin with. And that's going to depend on who you heard it from or where you learned it. And there is an authentication process that's happening on both sides. It's maybe not happening by the same precise mechanisms, but in some ways, I think they're more contiguous than either side would probably like to think.
Interesting phenomenon. Before I move on with the next question that I had for you, you mentioned that you gave a lecture recently, and I do want to mention that here because the lecture will be made public sometime in the future, and probably by the time that this video is uploaded, it will probably be available. The student organization of the HHP Center at the University of Amsterdam, that's the History of Hermetic Philosophies and Related Currents, invited Joel to come give a lecture, and he was talking about left-hand path traditions, and well, not a tradition, but a particular system, I guess you could say. And it was really a very, very interesting lecture. So not to get off too much on a tangent, but I did want to mention it here. I believe that the link will be made live on, or not live, but be made available on the channel of the HHP. And all of that information I'll put in the description box. I'll double check to make sure I have the right information. And I'll make sure that that is there so that people can view that as well, because it was a very interesting talk that you gave. And it also, I guess, links these two discussions in that we have a blending of different traditions that are going on with, even though in the other lecture, the people within the system are kind of wanting to not claim Western traditions and occult schools and systems of thought. They really are there, and they really are making use of them. So I guess it's kind of linking these two discussion, our discussion and your lecture, linking them together in that way. So I just wanted to make note of that so people can check you out there as well. But my last question for you is where people can find you if they want to know more about your research and your work.
Yeah, thank you. I have, well, probably the easiest way to do this, I think, would be that you can just put my name into Twitter, and then from there, there's a link to my Humanities Commons page, links out to my academia.edu and so forth.
Right.
I'm collecting some of these things, lectures and so on. Also, I have a YouTube. But if you use my name, you get like a real estate guy. So I'll just send you a link. It's too late, I guess, for me to actually get the old school user YouTube/your name page.
Right. Yeah.
That guy's got it.
Changed. Okay. But I will make sure that all of those links are included as well. Your YouTube and if people want to read this chapter for themselves about Batman, that is available on academia.edu. I'd like to thank you, Joel, for very interesting discussion today and also very fun discussion. Anytime we're talking about comics and things like that, I'm not a comic geek, I guess, but I'm close. I'm close to being a comic geek. So, but I just had a really fun time talking with you today, and thank you so much for making the time for this discussion. And I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add if you have any other thoughts.
I would say, I guess, one thing that if it wasn't clear earlier, just to sort of to put too terribly fine a point on it, I wouldn't put it past Morrison to. My point is not to say that he got all these things wrong necessarily. I wouldn't be surprised if he is well informed enough to know that he's using these things and he's taking some creative license with them. So I think that's one point that I would like to make sure that that's out there. I don't like to put myself in the position of of running around correcting so-called wrong notions about Buddhism and popular culture and so on. It's much more interesting to see what people do with them and maybe even in many cases assume that they may be doing those things in an informed way. And I think with someone like Grant Morrison, it seems extremely likely. Because he does refer to others of these practices in other contexts. It's not as if he is unaware of all the things that happen in the middle, necessarily. Right. He even shows Batman in other lines doing these things. So,
well, in any case, if the people reading these are inspired enough to go looking for it, then they'll start to learn more about it themselves. And of course, there's creative license being taken here. I mean, this is making for a really fascinating and creative story. So, you don't have to be strictly adhering to all of the rules in that regard. It makes it fun to be freer with all of these things and mix and match them as it fits the story as well. I mean, you have a particular idea about how the story should go. So, but thank you for pointing that out. That is a good point to make. It's not my intention either to say, no, you're wrong. Not at all. This is just I think what the chapter that you wrote does is it just offers a broadening of the perspectives in that sense. So I think that's a good thing. And it's always good to have a fun little access point to be able to learn new things about new things that maybe you didn't know about before or that you had been interested in, but you didn't really have a way of accessing that material in a way that's just very enjoyable. So again, I thank you
Absolutely.
for writing that chapter, and the way it all came about is kind of a funny story as well. That at the last minute they kind of pushed you to write about Batman. So it's all good. So I really really enjoyed the reading your work, and I enjoyed talking with you today. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Great, great.